In 1978, 25-year-old Alice Merrow was informed, not consulted, that a vast luxury resort was going to be built on the mountain ridge directly bordering her Vermont maple farm. The men who brought her this news arrived in long, immaculate wool coats, driving expensive vehicles that seemed entirely out of place on the rutted, frozen mud of her driveway. They did not come to ask for her blessing, nor did they come to negotiate as equals. They came with thick folders of surveying maps, architectural renderings, and a checkbook that they believed held the power to erase a century of family history. They stood in the dusty, wood-smoke-scented yard of her sugar house, looking around with a mixture of pity and thinly veiled disgust at the stacks of cordwood and the weathered siding of the outbuildings. The lead developer, a man with cold eyes and a smile that never reached them, unrolled a map across the hood of his vehicle. He pointed to the ridge, tracing a line that would soon become a jagged scar of glass, steel, and concrete. Then he pointed to Alice's valley, the deep, shadowed hollow where her family had tapped sugar maples since before the roads were paved. He told her that her land was the final piece of the puzzle, the necessary buffer zone for their grand vision of alpine luxury. He named a figure, a sum of money so large it was meant to be an immediate, unquestionable conclusion to her life as a farmer. He expected her to gasp, to weep with gratitude, to sign the papers on the hood of his car, and to vanish quietly into the modern world. He expected immediate surrender. Alice looked at the man, then looked past him to the dark, silent trunks of the ancient maples holding up the winter sky. She flatly refused. Let me tell you about the silence that followed her refusal. It was not a peaceful silence. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of men who have never been told no by someone they consider to be beneath them. The developer laughed, a sharp, barking sound that echoed off the tin roof of the sugar house. He looked at his colleagues, shaking his head as if he were dealing with a confused child. He told Alice that she did not understand the scale of what was coming. He warned her that the mountain was going to change, that the quiet life she knew was already dead, and that if she did not take the generous buyout now, she would eventually be choked out by the progress rising on the ridge above her. He promised her noise, he promised her disruption, and he promised her that within 5 years, she would be begging them to buy her out for a fraction of the price. The men gathered in that dusty yard had been trading real estate and breaking local holdouts since before she was a thought, and they believed they knew exactly what they were seeing in her, a stubborn, naive girl who would inevitably crack under the pressure of isolation and inconvenience. They packed up their maps, buttoned their expensive coats, and drove away, leaving behind a cloud of exhaust and the unspoken threat of a long, bitter siege. Alice did not crack. She simply turned around, walked back into the sugar house, and threw another heavy log of split ash into the roaring firebox of the evaporator. She was not a naive girl. She was the sole heir to a philosophy of the land that ran deeper than the bedrock those developers were about to dynamite. Her father, Elias Merrow, had been a quiet, solitary man who moved through the woods with the reverence of a monk in a cathedral. Elias had passed away 2 years prior, leaving Alice the farm, the equipment, and, most importantly, the ancestral wisdom required to survive in a world that valued quick profits over enduring roots. Elias had not farmed for wealth, he had farmed for harmony. He taught Alice that the sugar woods were not a factory, but a living, breathing lung. He taught her to read the bark of a maple tree the way a scholar reads a rare manuscript. He taught her that the land remembered everything, every drought, every harsh winter, every act of care, and every act of violence. The local farmers, the neighbors who lived down the valley, were quick to offer their unsolicited advice. They represented the conventional wisdom of the era, the pragmatic, debt-ridden mindset that viewed land merely as an asset to be leveraged or liquidated. When they heard about the developer's offer, they came to Alice's door, one by one, shaking their heads and leaning against her porch railing. They told her she was a fool. They told her about the soaring property taxes that would surely follow the resort's completion. They told her that a young woman alone could not possibly maintain a commercial sugaring operation while fighting a multi-million-dollar corporation. They urged her to take the money, to move to the city, to buy a modern house with a paved driveway, and forget about the grueling, back-breaking labor of boiling sap. Their collective skepticism was a heavy burden, a constant chorus of doubt that sought to undermine her resolve at every turn. They could not understand why she would choose the cold, the mud, and the endless work over a life of easy, purchased comfort. But Alice possessed a secret weapon, an inheritance far more valuable than the money the developers had offered. It was a collection of worn, leather-bound journals kept by her father and her grandfather before him. These were not mere diaries. They were meticulous, scientific records of the microclimate within their specific valley. For over 60 years, the Merrow men had recorded the daily temperatures, the snowfall totals, the direction of the wind, and the exact dates the sap began to run and when it stopped. Through these journals, Alice understood the absolute uniqueness of her land. Her hollow was a topographical anomaly, a deep basin where the heavy, freezing air pooled at night, extending the crucial freeze-thaw cycle of the maple trees for weeks longer than any surrounding ridge. While other farmers were pulling their taps and washing their buckets because the weather had grown too warm, the Merrow maples were still pouring out crystal-clear sap. This prolonged season was the source of their superior syrup, a biological advantage that no amount of developer money could replicate or purchase. The journals also contained a blueprint, a contingency plan drafted by Elias decades ago when the first paved roads began creeping toward their county. Elias had anticipated the encroachment of the modern world. He knew that the noise, the light, and the pollution of development could disrupt the delicate ecosystem of the sugar woods. In the back of the 1962 journal, Alice found a detailed, hand-drawn map of their property line bordering the upper ridge. Along this line, Elias had charted a dense, impenetrable natural barrier, a fortress of specific trees and shrubs designed to block sound, absorb artificial light, and physically repel intrusion. He had never needed to plant it during his lifetime, but he had left the instructions, the exact species required, and the spacing needed to create a living wall. This was the secret knowledge that gave Alice her confidence. She knew that she did not have to fight the developers in court or in the town hall. She would fight them in the soil. She would let the land defend itself. The subsequent 2 years were a master class in patience and endurance, a period of grueling struggle that would have broken anyone without Alice's deep roots. The construction on the ridge began in early spring, and it was a violent, earth-shattering affair. The developers brought in heavy machinery that tore away the topsoil, leaving massive bleeding wounds in the mountainside. The blasting of the bedrock shook the foundations of Alice's sugar house, rattling the tin roof and causing the antique evaporator pans to vibrate ominously. The noise was constant, a mechanical roar of diesel engines, grinding gears, and shouting voices that echoed down into her peaceful hollow. The exhaust fumes drifted down through the trees, a bitter, chemical scent that threatened to taint the pure air required for boiling sap. Worse than the noise was the disruption to the winter environment. As the resort's massive structures took shape, the developers installed bright, glaring construction lights that burned throughout the night, turning the dark, starry Vermont sky into an artificial, sickly orange dome. This light pollution confused the local wildlife, silencing the owls and driving the deer deeper into the woods. But the most critical threat came from the dust. The heavy machinery kicked up massive clouds of pulverized rock and dirt, which drifted down into Alice's valley and settled on the winter snowpack. This dark layer of dust absorbed the heat of the winter sun, causing the snow to melt prematurely. The snowpack was the natural insulation for the shallow roots of the maple trees, and its early loss threatened to warm the soil too quickly, prematurely ending the sap run and devastating her harvest. Have you ever found yourself standing alone against the tide of conventional wisdom, watching everything you hold sacred being threatened by those who do not understand its value? Let me stop and ask you something. When the world demands that you surrender your heritage for their convenience, do you fold or do you dig your roots deeper into the bedrock? Alice dug in. While the skeletal frame of the luxury resort rose higher and higher against the sky, Alice went to work on her father's blueprint. She took the small amount of savings she had and visited every local nursery within a 50-mile radius. She did not buy ornamental shrubs or delicate flowers. She bought hundreds of bare-root saplings, fast-growing Norway spruce, dense white pine, hardy balsam fir, and thick, thorny black locust. She hauled these saplings back to the farm in the bed of her father's rusted pickup truck. The physical labor of planting the barrier was monumental. Alice worked entirely alone, carrying bundles of saplings up the steep, rocky incline to the property line. She used a heavy steel digging bar to break through the glacial till, plunging her hands into the freezing mud to set the roots of each tiny tree. She planted them in staggered, overlapping rows, exactly as her father had diagrammed in his journal. The spruces were placed in the center to provide a towering, evergreen core. The white pines were staggered behind them to catch the wind. The thorny black locusts were planted on the outer edge, creating a hostile, impenetrable thicket that would deter any human from attempting to push through. It was agonizing, solitary work. Her hands were perpetually blistered and stained with soil. Her back ached from the constant bending and hauling. The neighbors, watching her toil on the ridge while the multi-million-dollar resort took shape above her, whispered that she had finally lost her mind. They saw a young woman planting twigs in the shadows of heavy machinery, a futile gesture of defiance against an unstoppable force. But Alice did not listen to the whispers. She knew that the soil was asleep, waiting for the right moment to awaken. She knew that the trees, though small now, possessed a genetic mandate to grow, to reach for the sun, and to interlock their branches into an unbreakable shield. The resort took 3 years to complete. During that time, Alice endured the helicopter tours that buzzed low over her canopy, the arrogant security guards who occasionally wandered over the property line to smoke cigarettes, and the constant, nagging doubt that perhaps the developers had been right. There was a private moment, late one freezing November evening, when Alice stood in the dark woods, listening to the thumping bass of a party echoing from the newly finished resort pavilion. She looked at her small, fragile barrier trees, which barely reached her waist, and felt a crushing wave of despair. The sheer scale of the resort, with its glowing windows and paved roads, felt overwhelming. She was tempted, just for a moment, to call the developer to ask if the offer was still on the table, to surrender and walk away from the cold and the mud. But then she walked into the sugarhouse and ran her hand over the cold, cast-iron door of the evaporator arch. She smelled the deeply ingrained scent of caramelized sugar and wood ash, the perfume of her family's history. She opened the leather journal to her father's neat handwriting, reading a passage from 1954, where he described a devastating ice storm that had snapped the crowns off 100 maples. He had written, "The woods do not weep for what is lost. They simply grow around the wound." Alice closed the book, her resolve hardening into something colder and stronger than the winter air. She would not sell. She would wait. The subsequent 2 decades were a masterclass in patience, a slow, silent victory measured in inches of growth and rings of heartwood. The resort opened to great fanfare, billing itself as the ultimate authentic Vermont experience. They catered to wealthy tourists from the cities, offering them a highly sanitized, curated version of nature. The resort featured gas fireplaces that turned on with a switch, perfectly paved walking paths that were swept clear of snow, and a massive dining room that served pancakes drenched in syrup that had been shipped in bulk from industrial farms hundreds of miles away. It was an illusion of rusticity, an expensive facade that lacked a soul. Meanwhile, Alice's barrier grew. The heavy spring rains in the fertile mountain soil nourished the saplings. The Norway spruces shot upward, their dense, dark green needles forming a thick curtain that blocked the glare of the resort's lights. The white pines spread their wide, sweeping branches, catching the wind and baffling the noise of the resort's traffic and machinery. The black locusts thrived, creating a tangled, thorny understory that made the property line completely impassable. Within 10 years, the barrier was a formidable wall of vegetation. Within 20 years, it was an impenetrable fortress. The noise of the resort faded to a distant, muffled hum. The artificial lights were completely blocked, returning the night sky over the hollow to its natural, starry brilliance. The microclimate of the valley was preserved, protected by the living shield Elias Merrow had designed. Then came the turning point. It was a late March morning, the heart of mud season. The days were warming, the nights were freezing, and the sap was running like a river beneath the bark. Alice was now a seasoned woman in her late 40s, her face lined with years of sun and wind, her hands strong and calloused from decades of manual labor. She fired up the evaporator, filling the firebox with dry ash and maple. The sap began to boil, sending a massive rolling plume of sweet, wood-scented steam up through the cupola of the sugar house. The wind caught that steam and carried it up the ridge, filtering it through the dense branches of the pine barrier and drifting it directly across the manicured lawns and outdoor patios of the luxury resort. It was an intoxicating, ancient smell. It was the smell of real fire, of boiling earth water, of authentic, unhurried labor. It was a scent that could not be manufactured, faked, or piped through a ventilation system. The guests at the resort, who had paid thousands of dollars for an authentic experience, stepped out onto their balconies and smelled the air. They looked out past the sterile gas fire pits and the paved walkways, trying to find the source of that incredible rustic perfume. They followed the scent to the edge of the resort's property, where they encountered the massive, thorny wall of Alice's barrier. They could not see the sugar house, but they could see the column of white steam rising above the pines. Eventually, a few adventurous guests found the old, rutted logging road that wound down the side of the mountain, bypassing the barrier and leading directly into Alice's hollow. They walked down the muddy path, their expensive boots sinking into the spring thaw, until they rounded the bend and saw it. The sugar house stood exactly as it had for 80 years, weathered and proud, surrounded by stacks of cordwood and old galvanized gathering tanks. Inside, Alice was moving with the fluid, practiced grace of a master, checking the temperature of the boiling sap, drawing off the finished syrup, and filtering it through heavy felt cones. Alice did not chase the trespassers away. She was not a bitter woman. She was simply a busy one. When the guests tentatively stepped into the warm, steam-filled sugar house, she merely nodded to them and handed them a small paper cup. She opened the draw-off valve and poured a tiny amount of hot, fresh syrup directly from the pan into the cup. She told them to drink it. The guests tasted the hot syrup, and in that single moment, the illusion of the resort above them was shattered. This was not the thin, uniform, industrial product they had been served at the breakfast buffet. This was liquid gold, complex and smoky, carrying the distinct terroir of the deep hollow, the minerals of the glacial soil, and the essence of the wood fire. It was a revelation. Word spread through the resort like a wildfire. A travel writer for a major national magazine happened to be staying at the resort that weekend on an all-expenses-paid press trip. The resort management had carefully planned his itinerary, scheduling him for hot stone massages, guided snowmobile tours, and private wine tastings. But the writer had smelled the smoke. He abandoned his itinerary, walked down the muddy logging road, and spent the entire afternoon sitting on an overturned bucket in Alice's sugar house. He watched her work. He listened to her explain the difference between a red maple and a sugar maple, the intricate chemistry of the boiling process, and the absolute necessity of the freeze-thaw cycle. He listened to her speak of her father, of the journals, and of the living barrier that protected the valley. The writer did not publish a glowing review of the luxury resort. Instead, he wrote a sprawling, poetic feature about the hidden ancient sugar house next door. He wrote about the woman who had defied the developers, who had protected her land with a wall of trees, and who was producing the finest, most authentic maple syrup in the country, using methods that had remained unchanged for a century. He contrasted the sterile, artificial luxury of the resort with the raw, undeniable reality of Alice's farm. The article was a sensation. The consequences were immediate and disastrous for the resort's management. Guests began canceling their expensive spa appointments and skipping the curated outdoor activities. Instead, they wanted to spend their days walking down the muddy road to sit in the steam of the sugar house. They wanted to watch the old FARMLAND tractor haul the gathering tank through the snowy woods. They wanted to buy Alice's syrup, paying premium prices for the dented tin cans filled with the dark, robust grade she produced late in the season. The resort's own gift shop, stocked with imported syrup in fancy glass bottles, sat empty. The guests wanted the real thing, and the real thing was precisely what the resort had tried to destroy. The developers were panicked. Their multi-million-dollar investment was being overshadowed by a weathered shed and a stubborn woman in mud-stained boots. They realized, with a sinking dread, that their guests were no longer coming for the resort itself. They were coming for the proximity to Alice's farm. The authenticity that Alice had fiercely protected had become the resort's only true attraction. This led to the moment of ultimate catharsis, the vindication that Alice had patiently awaited for over 20 years. The lead developer, the same man who had stood in her yard in his expensive wool coat and laughed at her refusal, was forced to make the long walk down the muddy logging road. He was older now, his hair graying, his arrogant stride replaced by a cautious, hesitant step as he navigated the deep ruts. He stepped into the sugar house, taking off his hat as the billowing steam enveloped him. Alice did not stop her work. She continued to stoke the fire, the roar of the flames filling the space between them. The developer stood awkwardly by the door, watching her. Finally, he spoke. He did not issue threats, and he did not offer a buyout. He asked, his voice tight with a mixture of frustration and genuine awe, "How did you know? How did you know that the trees would block the light? How did you know that the guests would eventually come down here?" Alice wiped her hands on a towel and looked at him. She did not gloat, nor did she raise her voice. She gave a simple, humble answer. "I didn't know about your guests," she said calmly. "I only knew about the trees. My father taught me that if you protect the roots, the branches will take care of themselves. You tried to build something on top of the mountain. We are part of the mountain." The developer swallowed hard. The arrogance of the establishment had been thoroughly broken by the slow, quiet power of the natural world. He explicitly admitted his defeat. "We were wrong," he said, the words heavy and difficult in his mouth. "I was wrong. We need you. Our guests are demanding this experience. If you stop boiling, if you shut down this operation, we lose our main draw. We are losing money because we cannot provide what you are providing for free." He offered a partnership. He proposed that the resort would pay her a massive annual retainer simply to keep her operation running exactly as it was. They wanted exclusive access for their guests to visit the sugar house, to observe the traditional methods, and to purchase her syrup. They offered to pave her road, to upgrade her equipment, to turn her farm into an official, sponsored attraction. Alice refused the upgrades. She refused the paved road. She refused to change a single aspect of her operation. She sat down on a wooden bench, pulled out a notepad, and began to write. She set every single term of the agreement. The resort would pay her the retainer, a sum far exceeding their original insulting buyout offer, simply for the privilege of existing next to her. She would retain absolute ownership of the land, the trees, and the syrup. The guests could visit only during specific hours, and only if they walked down the muddy road on foot. There would be no resort branding on her property, no guided tours led by resort staff, and absolutely no interference with the ecosystem of the hollow. The barrier trees would remain untouched, protected by a legally binding conservation easement paid for by the resort. The developer, stripped of his leverage and desperate to save his declining guest numbers, had no choice. He read the terms, his hands shaking slightly, and he signed the paper right there in the sugarhouse, resting the document on an overturned sap bucket. He had come to conquer the land, and he had ended up paying rent to the woman who refused to leave it. Let me explain the profound shift that occurred over the next few decades. The narrative of the valley completely transformed. The resort, which had once been a symbol of aggressive modernization, became entirely subservient to the rhythm of Alice's farm. The developers had to market their luxury experience around the agricultural calendar of the Merrow family. When the sap ran, the resort was full. When the boiling stopped, the resort emptied out. The multi-million-dollar corporation found its fortune entirely tethered to the health of the ancient maples and the quiet discipline of the woman who tended them. Alice grew into a respected elder, a living legend in the county. She became a symbol of resistance against the blind march of progress, proving that there is immense, undeniable power in refusing to compromise your heritage. The local farmers who had once mocked her and urged her to sell out now looked at her with a quiet, profound reverence. They saw that she had not only saved her family's legacy, but she had forced the modern world to bow to the ancient laws of the forest. She owned her massive acreage free and clear, funded by the very people who had tried to drive her away. In her twilight years, Alice did not work alone. She passed the torch to the next generation, taking on a young apprentice from the village, a quiet boy who showed the same reverence for the woods that Elias had possessed. She taught him how to read the bark, how to listen to the sound of the sap pinging into the metal buckets, and how to understand the deep, hidden currents of cold air that flowed through the hollow. She gave him her father's leather journals, showing him the hand-drawn map of the barrier trees, which were now towering giants, a permanent, living monument to patience and foresight. She taught the boy that true wealth is not found in a quick buyout or a leveraged asset. True wealth is found in deep knowledge, in self-reliance, and in the quiet satisfaction of knowing that you belong to the land just as much as the land belongs to you. She showed him that the loudest voices, the most arrogant experts, and the most heavily funded corporations are often blind to the slow, subtle truths of the natural world. The developer had said she would be choked out by progress, that she would be forced to sell the farm to survive. Instead, she kept the farm, she nurtured the barrier, and the land remembered her loyalty, rewarding her with a harvest so undeniable it brought the establishment to its knees. If you have ever wagered everything on an idea no one else believed in, if you have ever stood firm while the world demanded you compromise your roots, I ask you to subscribe to this journey. We are building a community of people who understand the value of deep knowledge and quiet endurance. Leave a comment below and tell me about a time you refused to fold under the pressure of conventional wisdom. Share this story with someone who needs to be reminded that the most powerful victories are often the ones that take decades to grow. Thank you for listening. I will see you in the next one.